Happy Easter, everybody. This is a very spontaneous online pop-up church from Sola Church. I'm Alan Rigg, lead pastor of Sola Church. As many of you know, we're launching in Santa Monica this fall. But here we are in quarantine like everybody else. I've got the whiskers to prove it. And just thought I'd jump online and just share some thoughts about what Jesus did for us on the cross 2,000 years ago. No doubt lots of you guys have Twitter. I'm on Twitter. My wife is on Twitter. Sola Church is on Twitter, at Sola Church LA. Love it if you gave us a follow. There's something like 5 million tweets every single day. That's crazy, right? They say that 80% of those come from a mobile phone, so people tweeting from their phone. But, hashtags sort of categorize tweets. And one popular hashtag is the hashtag live tweet. So people who are like attending or even watching a live event, may live tweet that event. And so sometimes we get like backstage, behind the scenes type information. Imagine if someone had been live tweeting from Calvary, if someone had been live tweeting the crucifixion, if they were live tweeting the things that Jesus said from the cross, well, there would have been 7 live tweets from the cross. And that's what I want to talk with you about here for just the next little bit. I'm going to be, reading some Bible verses that have these sayings of Jesus from the cross. If you want to look at them, you could turn to a couple places in your Bible. You could turn to John 19, put a bookmark there, and then join me in Luke chapter 23. In Luke chapter 23, beginning in verse 33, it says, "And when they had come to the place called Calvary, there they crucified him, and the criminals, one on the right hand and the other on the left. And then Jesus said, 'Father, forgive them, for they do not know what they do.'" So the cross has actually been called the most famous and popular symbol in all of history. It has inspired art. It has inspired body art. It has inspired performance art. Though it may have been invented by the Persians, it was no doubt perfected by the Romans. The ancient Jewish historian Josephus called crucifixion the most wretched of deaths. And in 337 AD, it was abolished in the Roman Empire by Constantine. C.S. Lewis once said that the crucifixion did not become a frequent motive for Christian art until the generations which had seen real crucifixions were all dead. That gives you some idea just how brutal it was. They might not have been able to imagine it eventually becoming, the inspiration for art like it is now. But it says that they came to a place called Calvary. That word Calvary actually means skull. So for a guy like me, I've been a pastor in the Calvary Chapel movement for 30 years. Our churches that are called Calvary Chapel, well, that means Skull Chapel. How cool is that? Somebody asks you where you go to church, you just say, well, go to the Skull. Go to Skull Chapel. Sounds pretty cool, right? And then in verse 33, it says, there they crucified him. So just to kind of give you an idea what this might have looked like, his hands would have been nailed through the wrists, actually, to the horizontal beam. And then the beam would be hoisted and attached to the vertical beam, likely dislocating the shoulders, that is, of the victim. Then his feet would be nailed through the heels, actually, to the vertical beam. The whole thing was so terrible that they actually invented a new word to describe it. That word is the word excruciating. You know that word. You may use that word from time to time. It literally means out of the cross. These crucifixions in ancient times, they were really nothing like the crucifixions that we have now. These were instead not secretive executions, but they were done in broad daylight, done out in the wide open. And so, here you have Jesus any victim of crucifixion between heaven and earth, not unlike a scarecrow. Maybe you've seen a scarecrow in a movie. Usually Jesus is depicted in a loincloth, and it's possible that he wore one, but it's more likely that he was actually fully naked. And so these victims of crucifixion, well, they would actually become incontinent. So imagine hanging on the cross, the embarrassment, the humiliation, and the shame. And so here we get the first live tweet from Calvary in verse 33 of Luke 23. Jesus said, "Father, forgive them, for they do not know what they do." So his first saying from the cross was actually a prayer. Kind of cool. Actually, of the 7 tweets, as we're calling them, 3 were prayers, the first, middle, and last. And it's worth noting that Jesus didn't pray for himself or even for his family members or friends who were there, but he prayed for his enemies, including the soldiers who had just crucified him. He didn't pray, forget them, or even get them, but he prayed, forgive them. And he gives a reason. He says, because they did not know what they were doing. In what sense did they not know what they were doing? Well, they didn't know the enormity. They didn't know that this was not just homicide, but deicide. Jesus was not just a man or even a good man. He was the God-man. Later, the Apostle Paul, writing to the church in Corinth, would say, had they known, they would not have crucified the Lord of glory. So, whereas we often cut each other no slack, Jesus was cutting even his executioners slack. So, a word about forgiveness. Sometimes a person might say, well, I can't forgive. But this teaches us that anyone can forgive. There was never anyone as innocent as Jesus. Sometimes we might say, well, I can't forgive that. But this teaches us that anything can be forgiven. There was never anyone as guilty as those responsible for his death. Well, let's move on to the second live tweet, picking it up here in Luke 23, in the middle of verse 34, right where we left off. It says, and they divided his garments and cast lots, and the people stood looking on. But even the rulers with them, that is, sneered, saying, he saved others, let him save himself, if he is the Christ, the chosen of God. The soldiers also mocked him, coming and offering him sour wine, and saying, if you are the king of the Jews, save yourself. And an inscription also was written over him in letters of Greek, Latin, and Hebrew, this is the king of the Jews. And then one of the criminals who were hanged blasphemed him, saying, if you are the Christ, save yourself and us. But the other, answering, rebuked him, saying, do you not even fear God, seeing you are under the same condemnation? And we indeed justly, for we receive the due reward of our deeds, but this man has done nothing wrong. And then he said to Jesus, Lord, remember me when you come into your kingdom. And Jesus said to him, assuredly, I say to you, today you will be with me in paradise. So they rolled dice for Jesus' personal belongings, and then the verbal abuse began. It tells us in verse 35 that the rulers sneered. In verse 36 that the soldiers mocked. In verse 39 that the criminals blasphemed. But the interesting thing is that Jesus actually died on another man's cross. Way back in verse 18, it mentions a man named Barabbas. Jesus actually took the place of Barabbas. He, in fact, took the place of each and every one of us. He probably died literally on Barabbas's cross. And those were probably Barabbas's partners in crime on his left and on his right. It's interesting that, a couple of times in the Gospels, Jesus was called the friend of sinners. That's good news if that's how you see yourself. Well, as in life, so in death, Jesus was the friend of sinners. It's funny, too, because Matthew and Mark tell us that both of these criminals blasphemed Jesus. And yet here we read that only one blasphemed. Is that a contradiction? No, it's a conversion. And it brings us to the second tweet, where Jesus said in verse 43, assuredly I say to you, today you will be with me in paradise. But how? When did this conversion happen? Well, I believe that he saw the sign over Jesus' head. As we read, it was written in 3 languages, Greek, Latin, and Hebrew. Greek was the language of philosophy, Latin, the language of law, Hebrew, the language of religion. And you know what Jesus did on the cross? He did for the whole world. But what it said in 3 languages is that he was the King of the Jews. You know, as you think about it, he looked like anything but a king at that moment, right? But this man, he believed it. He heard the prayer on Jesus' lips, forgive them, and he received it. And so we see 2 men. One trusted and was saved. One didn't trust and was lost. So many of us have this idea that there's a better time than now to connect with God, a better time than now to focus on, our relationship with God. If you are the kind of person who believes in a play now, pray later approach to life, this guy might be seen as your patron saint, except he isn't at all. Make no mistake about it. This guy, he didn't wait for his last opportunity to begin a relationship with God. He took advantage of his first. That's pretty awesome. Well, let's move on to the third live tweet. And so for that, we actually jump to that place we saved at the beginning in John chapter 19. So in John 19, beginning in verse 26, it says that when Jesus therefore saw his mother and the disciple whom he loved standing by, he said to his mother, "Woman, behold your son." And then he said to the disciple, "Behold your mother." And from that hour, that disciple took her to his own home. So there around the cross were Jesus' enemies, but also family members, his mom and his aunt, and also friends, including John, also known as the disciple whom Jesus loved. That's what he calls himself here in the Gospel of John. So rock star, right? Reminds me of Marshall Bruce Mathers III, whose stage name is Eminem, whose alter ego is Slim Shady. In the Gospel of John, he's known as the disciple whom Jesus loved. In his epistles, 1st, 2nd, and 3rd John, he's known as the elder. And then in Revelation, he's known just as John. Who knows what he'll be called in heaven? But here we do see that third tweet in verse 26, where he says to Mary, "Woman, behold your son." That doesn't sound good to our modern ears. Woman, it sounds harsh. Woman, but that's not at all what Jesus said or how he said it. Actually, what he used was a title of respect. And when he drew her attention to her son, he wasn't drawing Mary's attention to himself. He was drawing Mary's attention actually to John. John was to take Mary's place John was to take Jesus' place as Mary's earthly caregiver. And so for Mary, the cross was a place of reward. She'd been a wonderful mother to Jesus, and Jesus rewarded her by making sure that her needs would be met. But to John, in verse 27, Jesus said, "Behold your mother." So for John, the cross was a place of responsibility. Why didn't Jesus count on Joseph or his brothers to take care of Mary? Well, it's thought that Joseph was deceased, that Mary was a widow. And also Jesus' brothers, well, they didn't believe. They had not yet come to faith, and Jesus wanted to entrust the care of his mother to his disciple John. So the cross, well, it was a place of responsibility for John. It's a cross of responsibility for us all. The cross is a place where we're reminded that we're responsible not only to live for the Lord, but to look after others. Well, let's move on to that fourth live tweet. So that would be in verse 44. Let's see. Where it says in Luke, "Now it was about the 6th hour, and there was darkness over all the earth until the 9th hour." It's important to have a sense of this darkness. This darkness had enveloped the earth. It was everywhere. Everybody was enveloped in this darkness. And here it's where this fourth tweet comes. So it's actually recorded for us in Matthew and in Mark. But Jesus said, my God, why have you forsaken me?" Jesus was actually quoting from the Psalms. This was a quotation from Psalm 22, verse 1. Of these sayings from the cross, it's the only time that Jesus asks God a question. Clearly, Jesus felt abandoned. He felt forsaken. What was happening here? Actually, Jesus was at this very moment going from being sinless to being sinful. He became our sin. He was made to be the worst of what we are. This is what the great reformer Martin Luther referred to as the great exchange. Jesus was exchanging his perfection for our imperfection, his obedience for our disobedience, his intimacy for our distance, his blessing for our cursing, his life for our death. Have you ever had an unexplainable sense of loneliness? I mean, sometimes you can feel that way even in the middle of a crowd, but so many of us, as we look back on our life experiences, maybe you've come from a broken home or a blended family. Maybe you've been the victim of, maybe you've been through a divorce, or you've been the victim of abuse or neglect. There are so many reasons why people have experienced deep, dark feelings of abandonment. This generation has actually been called a generation alone because of the loneliness that seems to be so pervasive for so many people. And as great as our technology is, it's possible that in some ways, while it may have connected us more, in other ways, it's caused us to be less connected, maybe more virtually connected and less actually connected. And maybe we're really feeling that now, as you may be riding out the storm. This whole coronavirus, this whole COVID-19 situation where we're basically in lockdown, you may be writing this out literally alone. You may be the only person in your apartment or in your house. But even for those of us that are, with our immediate family, there may still be a feeling of disconnection from other family members, from friends, from coworkers, from neighbors. This is no doubt a time when lots and lots of people are struggling with those deep, dark feelings of aloneness that we were talking about. But Jesus was forsaken so that we might never be forsaken. Even when we're all by ourselves, we're never truly alone because the Lord is with us. Let's take a look at that fifth live tweet. That again is in our place there in John chapter 19. So I'm going to read verses 28 and 29. It says, "After this, Jesus, knowing that all things were now accomplished, that the scripture might be fulfilled, said, 'I thirst.' Now a vessel full of sour wine was sitting there, and they filled a sponge with sour wine, put it on hyssop, and put it to his mouth." So this fifth live tweet from the cross, "I thirst." This was a fulfillment of Psalm 22, verse 15. So, the first three sayings took place, during those first 3 hours. And then you had the middle saying that took place. And then you have the last three sayings that come in rapid succession right at the end. Now, this was the only time on the cross that Jesus referred to his own physical need. Up until now, he's prayed about a murderer's forgiveness. He's prayed about a man's salvation, or spoken about a man's salvation, spoken about his mother's care. All of this is sort of counterintuitive, right? Because for us, when life gets difficult, we think more about ourselves and not less. But Jesus teaches us that when life gets difficult, we need to think more about others, not less. How different would our lives be if when things get difficult, we thought less about ourselves and more about the people around us? I can't help but think about, what Jesus said to a woman at a well sometime before this. He was talking about the water in the well, and he said to her that whoever drinks of this water will thirst again. That is so true. I mean, I love Diet Coke. I love a sugar-free Red Bull. I love a quad espresso at Starbucks. That, by the way, would be like the holy trinity of caffeine. But no matter how many of those things I drink, I get thirsty again. I want another. Those body cravings are never fully or finally satisfied. And so they're a reminder that the cravings of our soul, the cravings of our spirit are never fully or finally satisfied without God. Jesus said in the very next verse to that same woman at that same well, he said, whoever drinks of the water that I shall give him will never thirst. Jesus wasn't schlepping bottled water. He was offering that true spiritual refreshment. It sounds too good to be true, but the truth is that Jesus can fully satisfy that spiritual thirst. Someone said one time that when you get the thing you wanted and you're still not satisfied, that wasn't really what you wanted. And basically all of the longings that we have in our lives are ultimately things that point us to our deepest longing. And that is our longing for God that's fully satisfied in Jesus. Let's look at that sixth tweet. Again, in John, there at the beginning of verse 30. So when Jesus had received the sour wine, he said, it is finished. He didn't say, I am finished. He didn't say that. He said, it is finished. So what was finished? Well, let's talk about that for just a moment. The law was finished. The prophets were finished. Jesus' suffering was finished. Jesus' work, that is the work of salvation, was finished. The penalty of sin in the life of the believer was finished. And then potentially and progressively, and when this life is over, permanently, the power and the presence of sin is finished. It's interesting, the verb tense. When he says it is finished, the verb tense suggests that it was finished once and for all. In other words, there was nothing else to be done. And how do we know that he was right about that? Well, among other things, we know he was right because he rose from the dead. We know he was right because after he'd risen from the dead, he ascended into heaven. We know he was right because after he ascended into heaven, he sent the Holy Spirit. Most of us have grown up thinking that good people go to heaven, or certainly religious people go to heaven. But do good people go to heaven? How good do you have to be? And how would you know whether you'd been good enough? Do religious people go to heaven? How religious would you have to be? And how would you know when you'd been religious enough? The cross teaches us that it's forgiven people who go to heaven. That forgiveness is not something you work for, it's something you receive. Jesus said it. It is finished. Let's look at that seventh live tweet. So now we jump back to our place in Luke. Luke 23, verses 45 and 46. It says, then the sun was darkened. We read that actually earlier. So picking it up in the middle of that verse, and the veil of the temple was torn in two. And when Jesus had cried out with a loud voice, he said, Father, into your hands I commit my spirit. And having said this, he breathed his last. So this seventh live tweet from the cross, very simple. Father, into your hands I commit my spirit. There are things at the cross that Jesus, that he commended or committed to others. His clothing to the soldiers, his mother to a friend, his body to one Joseph, but his spirit to his Father. It's been said that it was not death which approached Christ, but Christ death, and that is so true. At the time of his death, the veil in the temple was torn. I need to just describe that briefly. In the temple was the holy place, where so much of the priestly activity took place. And then at the far end of the holy place was the most holy place. There was a veil that separated the most holy place from the holy place. And so only one person, the high priest, and only once a year on the Day of Atonement could go beyond the veil into the most holy place. It was there that the presence of God was thought to be manifest in a unique way. It was referred to as the Shekinah glory of God. That's a Hebrew word, Shekinah. So it's like only one person once a year could get that close to God, had that unrestricted access to God. But when Jesus died, the veil was torn. It's interesting. It tells us that it was torn from top to bottom in Matthew and in Mark. And historians like Tacitus, Josephus, and even in the Jewish Talmud agree. Alfred Edersheim describes this veil as having been 60 feet long and 30 feet wide, and of the thickness of the palm of the hand. It was a total of 72 interconnected squares. It took 300 priests to even manipulate it, to shift it, to move it. So when it tells us that it was torn from top to bottom, no man did that. God himself did that. And when he did, he was declaring open house. Because of what Jesus accomplished on the cross, the access to God that people felt like wasn't there for them, now it was offered to everyone. It's offered to you. It's offered to me. God is declaring open house and inviting us in. You can come. You can come as you are. And then Jesus, of course, again, when he said those words, Father, into your hands I commit my spirit. Check this out. I read one time that this was a Hebrew prayer, that Jewish boys and girls as children were taught to pray this prayer at bedtime. It's as if Jesus, in his last moments on the cross, said, now I lay me down to sleep. I pray the Lord my soul to keep. If I should die before I wake, I pray the Lord my soul to take. And he was gone. He became the unforgiven that we might become the forgiven. You know, if you've never trusted Jesus to forgive you and to lead you, you could do that today. You could do that right where you are. You could say a simple prayer, thanking him for what he did for you in the cross, asking him to forgive your sins and to come into your life and to be your leader. That would be the greatest way you could celebrate Easter. And of course, the things we talked about just now, they took place on Good Friday. On Easter Sunday morning, the tomb was empty. Jesus had risen, and he appeared to his followers. And as I talked about earlier, after spending some time with them, he ascended back into heaven where he's seated at the right hand of God. Easter Sunday, the tomb is empty. You know, those were dark days, Friday, Saturday, even waking up Sunday morning until they knew what had happened. Those were some dark, dark days. Maybe you feel like you're living in some dark days now. We are, aren't we, together? Aren't we living in some dark days? We really are. But the resurrection, Easter Sunday, reminds us that it's never over. It's definitely not over until God says it's over. As long as God is in the picture, you know, there's always hope. And things aren't always going to be the way they are now. We're going to get through this. And when we do, we're going to need each other, and we're going to need God more than ever before. So just a quick reminder that we're launching Sola Church in Santa Monica this fall. We're scheduling online interest meetings now for those that want to learn more, since we can't meet in person. And if you're interested in participating in one of those, would you message us? Just send us a message right here on Facebook or go to our website, solachurch.life. We have contact information there. We'd love to connect with you. You know, maybe you don't live there, but you know someone who does, and you'd like to try to put us in touch with them. That can happen so easily. Again, if you would just reach out to us, you could, tag them in a comment here on this video. You could send it to them. You could reach out to us to get more information that you could send to them. We'd sure be excited to connect with you in that way. So we love you guys. Happy Easter from me, from Miranda, from Odessa. Hang in there. We're praying for you, and we'll connect with you here online again soon.